They say that near the slopes of Mount Parnassus, just before dawn, the air carries something other than silence. It is not merely wind. It is a breath older than language. A whisper that weaves itself between the cypress trees and the jagged rock, curling like incense through the olive groves and broken columns, brushing gently against the sleeping earth as if some ancient voice were still speaking, long after the world forgot how to listen. Tonight, you are not merely listening to a story. You are stepping into a place where time doesn't move forward, it coils. Where the stars are not just burning suns, but watchful eyes. And where every shadow holds the memory of a prayer. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply let your gaze soften. The journey begins not with footsteps, but with stillness. Now, imagine a mountain rising from the bones of Greece. Not harsh, but solemn. Its name is Parnassus. Its breath is myth. And nestled into the folds of its southern face is a sanctuary. A place once called the center of the world, Delphi. But before it became Delphi, it was only stone. Stone and silence. And the stars. They came first, long before gods or mortals laid claim to meaning. The stars had already charted their slow dance across the sky, and they looked down upon this mountain with particular fondness. Perhaps they saw what was coming, or perhaps they, too, were waiting for a voice. You see, legend says that the very center of the earth was discovered here, not through conquest, not through maps, but through an omen. 2 eagles, released by Zeus from opposite ends of the world, met in the sky above this mountain. And where they crossed, the gods placed a stone, the omphalos, the navel of the earth. And so it was said, this was the axis of existence. Not a city, not a battlefield, but a quiet place where rock met sky and breath met mystery. But we're still far from temples, far from oracles and kings. Tonight, we linger in the silence before the myth. When the air was thick with time and anticipation. When shepherds whispered of strange dreams beneath the moonlight. And the wind sometimes called your name in a voice not quite human. It is said that the earth itself once spoke here. That beneath the rocks, there were veins not of water or fire, but of vision. Perhaps the mountain had thoughts. Perhaps the earth, being ancient and aching with memory, needed someone to speak for her. And so, the winds began to change. At night, the air cools and the sky presses low like a great dome of velvet. The olive branches barely move. And in this hush, you might hear it, a sigh or a hum, or the faintest murmur that doesn't belong to any bird or beast. That is the echo, the one that guided kings, the one that outlived empires, the one that still lingers in dust and dreams. It does not shout. It never did. Its strength was always in subtlety, in suggestion, in that space between what is said and what is meant. And so we begin here, not with battle cries or divine commands, but with a murmur carried on the wind, a whisper beneath the stars, inviting you to come closer, to breathe slower, to remember, because sometimes history does not begin with a thunderclap. Sometimes it begins when a woman sits in silence and listens to the mountains speak. They say the gods once argued about where the earth began, not in anger, but in curiosity, because even for the divine, some questions remain cloaked in mystery. Where does the world begin? Where does it end? Where, if anywhere, does the heart of the earth truly rest? And so, Zeus, the great god of sky and thunder, the ruler of Olympus, decided to find an answer. Not with fire, not with force, but with flight. He took 2 golden eagles, radiant and fierce, and released them from opposite ends of the world. One flew east, the other west. They soared over forests that whispered secrets, oceans that glittered with forgotten gods, and deserts that hummed with silence. And when they met, they circled, not in battle, but in reverence. They spiraled downward, their wings carving invisible symbols into the air, until they landed together on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. And there, the gods declare was the center, the axis, the still point of a spinning world. Delphi. They marked the spot with a stone, oval, carved, veiled in mystery. The omphalos, the navel, a sacred symbol pulsing with meaning, where the divine touched the earthly. It did not roar. It did not gleam. It simply sat silent and immovable like the breath between two heartbeats. Even now, in the museum beside the ruins, the omphalos rests beneath glass. Worn, smooth, strange in a way that makes the bones ache. Not large, but impossibly heavy with significance. They say the stone is hollow, that it was once wrapped in wool, pierced with bronze, and anointed with oil. It was not simply a relic. It was alive in the way that myths are alive, a container of mystery. But the omphalos was not just a symbol for gods. It was a beacon for mortals. Because if this truly was the center of the world, then all paths eventually would lead here. All questions would converge. All doubts, no matter how heavy or tangled, might find unraveling in this sacred place. Kings came, peasants came, mothers with trembling hands, soldiers with haunted eyes, lovers with quiet hope, all drawn by the promise of a place where the veil between heaven and earth had thinned, where answers might be whispered between breaths. But the center of the world is not made only of geography. It is made of meaning. And so Delphi grew, not as a city of conquest, but of listening. No towers, no walls, just a sanctuary carved gently into the mountain's shoulder, where marble stepped lightly upon the bones of older stone. Temples bloomed like white lilies in the rock. Colonnades stretched toward the sky like quiet prayers. The scent of laurel, burnt offerings, and mountain thyme mingled in the wind. And always, at its heart, the omphalos, silent, still, endlessly waiting. It did not give prophecies. It did not change empires. But it reminded all who stood before it that there is a place in the world where the soul might kneel, not in fear, but in wonder. Because in the ancient world, to stand at the center was not a matter of conquest. It was an act of humility, a surrender, a letting go, a way of saying, I do not know, but I have come to listen. Perhaps that's what Delphi was and is. Not an answer, but an invitation. Even now, if you walk the stones of the ancient path, if you close your eyes and feel the air settle on your skin like a memory, you might sense it, the soft pull of the earth's breath, the stillness at the center, the navel of the world, not lost, not broken, but dreaming. And tonight, you are closer to it than you've ever been. Before temples, before priests, before marble columns rose to scrape the belly of the sky, there was only the earth. Not the earth as we know it, mapped, measured, conquered, but a living, breathing presence. A consciousness vast and deep. She had no crown, no throne, no name at first. But when the first people looked around them and then looked inward, they felt her. And they called her Gaia, not a goddess in the image of man, but the earth herself, soil, stone, river root, womb and tomb, the beginning and the end, pulsing in one slow rhythm beneath everything that grew or crumbled. In the cradle of Mount Parnassus, before the songs of Apollo echoed through marble halls, it was Gaia who whispered, and Delphi belonged to her. The earliest sanctuary was not carved by chisels, but by reverence. A cave, perhaps, or a cleft in the earth, where steam rose softly in the morning and birds flew in strange, slow spirals above. There were no statues, no hymns etched in gold, only the breath of the mountain and the listening. They say her voice rose not in thunder, but in vapors, invisible fingers of mist that curled from the earth like secrets, warm and weightless. And those who inhaled them, priestesses of Gaia, were filled with something vast and unknowable. They didn't call it prophecy. They called it remembering, because Gaia did not predict. She remembered forward, as if time, for her, was a spiral, not a line. What had happened and what would happen were simply layers of the same breath. And she offered fragments of that breath to those who dared come close. These early oracles were not exalted. They were chosen by nearness, by surrender. Women who lived close to the soil, who knew the cycles of the moon not by charts, but by the ache in their bones. They would sit at the edge of the chasm, legs tucked beneath them, eyes half closed, and wait. Wait for the mist. Wait for the pulse. Wait for the moment when Gaia's breath would enter them like warm smoke and fill their mouths with truths they could not understand, only release. They did not speak in riddles then. They sang, low rhythmic tones, like the hum of roots, a language without words, older than memory, vibrating through bone and stone alike. And the people listened. They brought offerings, not gold, but fruit, honey, woven cloth, strand of their own hair. Gifts of gratitude, not greed. Because to stand before Gaia was not to make demands. It was to remember your place in the great, breathing body of the world. To ask a question of Gaia was to ask it of yourself. And to receive an answer was not a solution, but a mirror. In those early days, Delphi was not a place of glory. It was a place of humility. And it was sacred because it was quiet. But of course the world changed. Gods rose. Empires grew. And the breath of Gaia, so soft, so primal, was slowly veiled beneath other voices. The serpent came. The god came. The rituals grew more elaborate, the words more precise. And yet, beneath it all, she remained, in the roots of the laurel trees, in the softness of the soil under the temple's foundation, in the scent of the rising mist that still, on certain days, escapes from cracks in the earth like memories trying to find their way home. Sometimes, even Apollo paused and listened, because even gods, they say, are born from Gaia's womb. Even they must return to her silence. So tonight, as your breath softens and your body sinks into stillness, know this, you are not far from her. The same earth that breathed beneath those ancient priestesses now lies beneath you. And maybe, if your dreams are quiet enough, you'll hear her, not in words, not in visions, but in a sensation like warmth in your chest or the feeling of being held. Gaia does not answer. She surrounds, and in her presence, nothing is ever truly lost. Beneath Delphi, beneath the white gleam of marble, beneath the offerings, the hymns, the breathless prayers, there is something else, something older, something that did not shimmer in sunlight, nor echo with the lyre. It moved without moving. It watched without eyes. It coiled, not around the pillars of a temple, but deep in the belly of the mountain, where the stone remembers the fire from which it was born. They called it Python, not a snake in the way we imagine, a creature of scales and fangs, but a force, a presence, a pulse of the earth that slithered through dreams and shadows. It was said to be the child of Gaia herself, born not of violence, but of silence and pressure, shaped from the same soil that once cradled the roots of prophecy. Python was not evil. It was never that simple. It guarded something, or perhaps it was what it guarded. The early myths whisper that Python curled around the sacred navel stone, the omphalos, not to trap it, but to protect it. It hissed softly in the darkness, its voice a blend of vapor and memory, a lullaby for those who dared to come too close. Some say Python lived inside the chasm, that the gases which rose and intoxicated the first seers were its breath, warm, thick, laced with fragments of other realities. And when women sat above the fissure, trembling with vision, it was not just the earth they communed with, but the serpent itself. It whispered in riddles. It offered glimpses of fates too vast for mortal minds. And those who returned from a mist never quite spoke the same. But then the god came, Apollo, brilliant, golden, adorned in youth and certainty. A god of music, order, clarity. He did not come quietly. He came with a bow. And the myth, as it's told, is a story of conquest. A radiant god slaying the ancient serpent, claiming the sanctuary, and turning chaos into symmetry. They say Apollo shot Python with 1,000 arrows, that the mountain shook, that the serpent bled into the stone, its dreams seeping into the earth where they would never die, only wait. And so, the god took the shrine. The sanctuary became his, and the priestess, once listening to Gaia, now listened to him. But myths are rarely simple, and the earth does not forget. Some believe that Apollo did not truly kill Python. He absorbed it. He took its breath and buried it beneath his temples, beneath his songs, beneath the polished rituals that carried his name. The oracle, even in Apollo's time, still sat above the chasm, still inhaled the sacred mist, still trembled and spoke in voices that came from somewhere beyond herself. So who then truly spoke? Was it Apollo? Or was it still Python, coiled beneath the stone, curled into the folds of the mountain's memory, murmuring through the cracks? Even the Pythia's name carried the serpent's trace. She was called the Pythia, a name born from Python himself. As if, despite the god's victory, the serpent still licked the edge of every prophecy. And maybe that was the point. Delphi, after all, was never a place of certainty. It was a place of tension, between God and beast, between clarity and confusion, between sky and soil. And in that tension, truth lived, not as an answer, but as a question that shimmered and shifted like smoke. Tonight, as we descend deeper into the myth, let's not rush to judge the serpent. Let's not name it evil or monstrous or lost. Let's imagine instead that it still lies there. Not dead, not gone, just sleeping, coiled around the roots of the sanctuary, warmed by the heartbeat of the earth, dreaming dreams that rise like mist into the mouths of those who dare ask for more than silence. And maybe, just maybe, when we sleep, when our thoughts grow slow and our breath softens like the soil before rain, we hear it too, not with our ears, but with something older, something that lives just beneath our ribs. The serpent speaks not in words, but in symbols, not in noise, but in feeling. And when it moves, the earth remembers. So rest now. Let the mountain hold you. Let the serpent's coils wrap gently around your thoughts, not to trap them, but to cradle them. You are safe here, deep in the folds of Delphi, where gods sing above and serpents dream below. They say he came in spring, not with thunder, not with war drums, but with the hush of melting snow and the silver shimmer of wings. Apollo, the god of light, of prophecy, of music, of the sun's golden fingers brushing the earth at dawn. But he did not arrive in fire. He descended, they whisper, on the back of a swan, its feathers whiter than moonlight, its silence deeper than the sea. It glided through the air as if it belonged to some softer world, its wings parting clouds like veils. Below it waited Delphi, still raw, still trembling from the slaying of Python. The earth had opened. The old serpent had gone silent. The mist still lingered, but it had no name now. The sanctuary was empty, not of presence, but of purpose. And then came Apollo. He did not walk the path of mortal kings. He floated through it, hair like poured sunlight, skin dusted in the gold of dawn, a lyre cradled in one hand, and in the other, the laurel branch, sacred and evergreen. The god who had killed now came to create. He stepped gently upon the earth he had claimed, and with each touch, the land softened beneath him, not from fear, but from recognition. And the stones listened. They had known chaos, earthquakes, winds, the hiss of Python's breath beneath their feet. Now they knew something else. Order, rhythm, a new kind of fire, one that warmed instead of burning. Apollo chose Delphi, not as a fortress, not as a palace, but as a home for his voice. Because more than anything, Apollo was a god of sound, not the clamor of battle, but harmony. He was the breath between notes, the silence between questions. And in Delphi, he would place his instrument, not a sword, not a law, but the oracle. He found the chasm where the old priestesses had once knelt, their bodies trembling with Gaia's dreams and Python's visions. He did not seal it. He did not bury it. Instead, he claimed it. And from that chasm, his voice would rise. But Apollo, for all his light, was not only gentle. His beauty was sharp, his wisdom cruel, his answers veiled. He was, after all, the god of prophecy, and prophecy is never comfort. It is clarity in riddles. It is the truth given too early or too late. The oracle, now devoted to him, would not speak plainly. She would speak in fragments, in echoes, in the rhythm of leaves rustling in a wind that does not come from this world. It is said that Apollo established his temple upon the bones of the old sanctuary. He crowned it with stone. He filled it with light. He placed a tripod above the chasm, and from that perch, a woman, chosen not for her beauty, nor for her power, but for her stillness, would inhale the sacred breath and become his voice. She would not speak for herself again. Apollo did not ask her to invent. He asked her to surrender, to open herself like a hollow reed through which his music could play. And so, the first Delphic Pythia sat upon the tripod, crowned with laurel, drifting in mist, and her words, once earthy and slow, now sang in riddles that shimmered with godlight. She became the living chord between two worlds, and the god, though distant, whispered through her lips. But this was not domination. This was transformation. For even Apollo, radiant and high, needed the mortal to give him form. Without the Pythia, his voice was a silence no one could hear. Without her breath, his light would not bend into words. And so, God and woman danced, not in steps we can see, but in vibrations, in trance, in breath shared between flesh and myth. Delphi became his sanctuary, but not a place of rest, a place of listening, of asking, of trembling just before the answer. People came from distant coasts, from sun-bleached deserts and deep river valleys. They came not to see the god, but to hear him. And the god waited. He did not always speak, but when he did, the world shifted. They say that when Apollo entered the temple, it was not with fire, but with music, that the very stones would hum with the tension of his presence, that the air would become heavier, as if carrying too much meaning. And when he left, silence followed, like the hush after a storm. Not destruction, but awe. Even now, some say you can feel him in the ruins, not in the broken columns or the fallen archways, but in the space between, in the air that holds its breath. Because gods don't live forever, but they linger, especially those who arrived on swan wings, who killed serpents not to conquer, but to crown, who turned a mountain's breath into poetry. So tonight, As you lie beneath the hush of stars, remember this. There was once a God of light who descended into shadows, not to banish them, but to speak through them. And if you listen closely, if you let your thoughts soften and your breath slow, you might still hear the first note of his lyre, gliding gently through the silence, reminding you, not all voices shout, some simply shine. She did not ask to become the mouthpiece of God. She was not born with stars in her blood or thunder in her voice. She was a woman like any other. She bled with the moon. She laughed in secret. She walked through the fields of her village barefoot, trailing her fingertips through barley as the sun turned her skin the color of honey. And yet, the God chose her, not for beauty, not for ambition, but for the quiet that lived inside her. The Pythia, that is what she would become. But before the laurel touched her brow, before her lips formed riddles that shaped empires, she was just one soul. An empty vessel made sacred not by what she possessed, but by what she released. They say the process was gentle, or perhaps only from the outside. She was led to the temple of Apollo, high upon the southern slope of Mount Parnassus, where the stones hummed with age and incense hung like dusk in the air. The air smelled of bay leaves, beeswax, and old secrets. Women in flowing white robes, older Pythias, now guardians of ritual, washed her feet in spring water, anointed her temples with sacred oil, and braided her hair with strands of wool. But the true preparation happened within, in silence, in surrender. She fasted, she dreamed, she sat in stillness as the mountain breathed around her, feeling the subtle thrum beneath the stone, the pulse of something larger than herself. And then, one morning, just before the sun crested the cliffs, they brought her to the Adyton, the deepest chamber of the temple. It was not grand. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to veil, to hold what was too sacred for the open air. There the tripod stood, a three-legged seat of bronze, balanced above the sacred chasm where the earth still whispered. The omphalos stone rested nearby, wrapped in wool, marked with age. She approached slowly. There was no ceremony, no trumpet, no proclamation. Only breath, only the faint, sweet scent of burning laurel. Only the slow rising of the mist, soft, warm, and filled with the god's breath, or perhaps the serpent's dream. And she sat, not as a queen, not as a priestess, but as a mirror, an instrument. And in that moment she changed. The transformation was not violent. It was total. Her body began to sway gently, as if rocked by a rhythm deeper than her bones. Her eyelids fluttered, her breath deepened, and then she spoke. But her words did not belong to her. They rose from somewhere beneath language, shaped by forces that do not speak in sentences, but in images, heat, and memory. The priest would gather her riddles, frantic and reverent, writing down her fragmented speech like sacred code. They would interpret them, bend them, twist them, sometimes betray them, until a message emerged. But she, the Pythia, did not interpret. She released. Her voice, some said, echoed with wind and fire. Others claimed it was barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves in winter. Some would watch her eyes, clouded, distant, flickering with visions too vast to anchor. She did not see with her sight. She saw with her being. And what did she see? They never told us. The oracle never wrote her own story. But I like to imagine that beneath the trance, beneath the smoke and stone and godlight, she felt something exquisite. Not power, not terror, but a strange, bittersweet kind of love. A love that does not protect, but reveals. A love that opens a woman wide enough for the divine to pass through. But such love leaves a mark. The Pythia never kept her position for long. The trance, the sacred breath, the weight of being a vessel, it drained her. The god was too large, the channel too narrow. So after a season, sometimes a year, sometimes two, she would step down. Return to the world with soft hands and haunted eyes. Live quietly in a village by the olive trees. Whisper only to birds and river stones. She would never speak of what she had seen. Not because she was forbidden, but because there are some truths that language cannot carry. And yet, she was never forgotten. Each new Pythia stood upon the breath of the last. Each one carried echoes, like the echo of Apollo's lyre beneath the stars, or the echo of Python's breath beneath the stone. They were not individuals. They were a lineage of listening, a chain of silence broken only in riddles. And through them, Delphi lived, not as a city, not as a ruin, but as a living song, passed from woman to woman, sung not in melody, but in mystery. So tonight, as you lie in the stillness of your own temple, your body, your breath, I invite you to imagine her, the Pythia, a young woman in white, sitting above the chasm of the earth, bathed in mist, held in the arms of the god, and letting go of everything she thought she was, to become a whisper that shaped the world. Not all power shouts. Some sits in silence and breathes. And in the hush of this night, perhaps you can hear her, still. It is said that beneath the temple of Apollo, where the marble now lies broken, kissed by moss and sunlight, there is a wound in the earth, a crack, a mouth, a pulse. It does not bleed. It breathes. The ancients called it the chasm. To some, it was merely a fissure in the stone, a place where the earth had split long ago, perhaps during some forgotten tremor, and never quite healed. To others, it was a vein of the world itself, a portal not to the underworld, but to the invisible. But those who served at Delphi knew better than to speak of it too plainly. They did not name it in full. They did not measure it. They bowed, because from this chasm rose something that could not be held, but could be felt. They called it pneuma, the sacred vapor, the breath of Apollo, or of Gaia, or of Python, depending on whom you asked. It was scentless, colorless, and yet utterly consuming. The Pythia inhaled it, not in gulps, but in surrender. She sat above the chasm, her body barely tethered to the world, her skin bathed in the warmth rising from deep below. And something changed. Her breath grew slower. Her eyes rolled back. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the strange thrill of dissolving. She was no longer only a woman. She was becoming a conduit. But what exactly entered her? For centuries, this question whispered through the halls of scholars and mystics alike. Was it divine? Was it poison? Was it madness or revelation? Perhaps all of them. In recent times, our times, men with measuring rods and gas meters have come to Delphi, digging not for omens, but for data. And what they found only deepens the mystery. Beneath the temple lie intersecting fault lines, cracks in the geological crust of Greece, where tectonic plates shift and murmur in their long, slow dance. And from these wounds in the stone rise gases, ethene, benzene, methane, gases that, in the right concentration, can alter consciousness. They do not kill. They open. They loosen the grip of the rational mind. They dislodge the ego's heavy anchor. They invite visions. And the chasm offers just enough to unmoor the Pythia, to draw her into the in-between, where voices have no language, and time forgets its direction. She did not hallucinate. She translated, from vibration to sound, from breath to prophecy. She spoke in riddles not to confuse, but because no truth that large can fit into clean lines. Truth, when raw, must arrive like thunder filtered through silk, fractured but full. And yet, this experience so sublime, so holy, left marks. The Pythia would emerge pale, shaken, sweating, sometimes weeping. Some collapsed into silence after their trance, unable to recall what they had said. Others wandered the sanctuary for hours, humming or whispering to themselves, as if Apollo had left his fingers gently tangled in their minds. They were not possessed, they were touched, and perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, because this breath that rose from the chasm, this invisible current that shaped nations, that whispered in riddles to kings, that became law and legend and destiny, was not thunder, nor fire, nor miracle. It was a gas, a fume, the earth exhaling her ancient heat into the hollow of a mountain. Nature simply doing what nature does. And yet, within that breath, a woman trembled, a god spoke, and the world listened. So what does that mean? Does it cheapen the myth? Or does it make it more sacred? To know that something as ethereal as prophecy was born from something as earthly as vapor? Perhaps it reminds us that the divine does not always descend from the heavens. Sometimes it rises from below, not in lightning, but in breath, not in command, but in invitation, not to destroy, but to awaken. Even now, if you walk the path to the temple ruins, if you place your palm gently on the stones still warm from the sun, you might feel a subtle hum beneath your skin. Not loud, not sharp, but steady. The breath of the chasm is weaker now. The earth no longer speaks with the urgency it once held, but it still breathes. In the silence, in the stillness, in the gaps between thoughts, when her mind has finally grown quiet enough to feel. And perhaps that breath has always been with you. In the moments of clarity that arrive without warning. In the dreams that carry a message you didn't know you needed. In the ache in your chest when you feel something vast and wordless pass through you. That too is prophecy. That too is the breath beneath the world. So sleep now, softly, as if resting on the edge of a chasm older than time. Let your thoughts drift like mist. Let your soul inhale what it needs. And know that even now, beneath all things, something is still speaking. They did not come empty-handed. Those who climbed the winding, sun-baked path to Delphi, pilgrims, generals, shepherds, and kings alike, carried more than questions. They carried offerings. Some came with purses weighed in silver, others with statues hammered in bronze, or crowns of hammered gold shaped like leaves trembling on invisible winds. Some brought carved ivory, black obsidian, amphorae of oil too rich for common use, or figs dried by the same sun that scorched their sandals. A few came only with tears, or a lock of hair from a beloved gone to sea. Even that was enough, because Delphi was not just a place of answers. It was a transaction, not of coin and speech, but of faith and silence. You gave what you could, and in return, you waited. They did not give to buy the truth. They gave to make space for it, to step closer, to be seen, to be heard, not by the crowds, but by the divine. And so, the sanctuary swelled with beauty. Before the first question was asked, before the oracle ever opened her mouth, Delphi was already a forest of offerings, an orchard of devotion rooted not in soil, but in stone. Bronze tripods stood like skeletal trees, their 3 legs planted firmly, their bowls once filled with sacred fire. They glittered in the sunlight like ancient echoes of stars. There were votive statues, many no taller than a hand, delicate, thoughtful, a lion cub, a flute player, a kneeling youth. Figures carved by hands long dead, carried across mountains just to kneel before a god. The treasuries lined the sacred way, one after another. Small marble buildings that looked like miniature temples, each built by a different city-state. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, Sparta, all once enemies on the battlefield. Here they stood side by side, not in blood, but in worship. Inside those treasuries lay not just wealth, but memory. Golden shields from wars long past. Gilded laurel crowns given to champions of the games. Stone tablets etched with promises kept or broken. It is said that Croesus, king of Lydia, sent more gold than Delphi had ever seen. Molten ingots, bowls of pure silver, even a lion made entirely of gold, paw raised, gaze eternal. He asked the oracle if he should go to war with Persia. The Pythia answered, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." He smiled. He crossed the river, and it was his own empire that burned. Even so, Delphi kept his gifts, because in Delphi, offerings were not judged. They were witnessed. Each gift placed within its walls became part of the oracle's breath. Not merely symbols of gratitude or desperation, but prayers with weight. The air inside the temple grew thick with them. Thick with incense. Thick with history. Thick with longing so dense it clung to the skin. Imagine walking those corridors. Your footsteps muffled by dust. Your shadow stretching across ancient walls. The scent of laurel and beeswax wrapping itself around you like a memory you never lived. And everywhere, gifts. Not untouched, not pristine, but glowing softly with the warmth of 1,000 hands that once trembled as they placed them down. Even now, in museums far from Greece, some of these offerings remain. A bronze hand missing its fingers, a coin with a forgotten face, a necklace made not to adorn, but to plead. They sit behind glass, silent, still, but even here they hum, because a true offering never really dies. It holds the intention of its giver, and that intention, once given, belongs to time. The laurel was sacred to Apollo. It crowned poets and victors. But at Delphi, it became more than a wreath. It became a language. Branches were laid at the temple's door, worn around the neck, crushed and burned to scent the air before prophecy. A sign that the one who entered came not to speak, but to listen. To offer a laurel leaf was to say, "I come without weapons. I come to be changed." And Delphi changed them all. It did not promise clarity. It did not guarantee joy, but offered contact with something larger, older, and more intricate than any single life. And for that, people gave. Everything. Even now, if you lie still enough. If your breath softens and the edges of thought begin to blur, you might feel it, that impulse to give. Not money, not fame, not words, but something smaller, something sacred. Your trust, your openness, your quiet. That too is an offering. And perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere deep beneath the mountain, among the crumbled tripods and forgotten gold, the oracle still listens. And tonight, she hears you. Before the question was asked, before the tripod whispered, before the god spoke, there were footsteps, thousands of them, over dust, over stone, over fields that sighed in the wind. Long before prophecy, there was the pilgrimage. They came from all corners of the known world, from highland villages where snow never melted, from islands where the sea glittered like shattered glass, from cities bloated with markets and smoke. They came walking, some on horseback, some carried in palanquins, but most on foot, sandals worn thin, toes blistered, hearts full. They came chasing something that could not be seen. Not a miracle, not a vision, just a word. A single word, if it came from Delphi, could shape a life. A sentence might guide an army or prevent a war. A riddle might lead to peace or madness. And so they walked, day after day beneath the unrelenting sun. Nights curled beneath olive trees, listening to the chirp of crickets and the rustle of laurel leaves above. The dust of the road clung to their ankles like memory. But the weight they carried was not just physical. They carried the weight of uncertainty, of sleepless nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering why, of choices they could no longer make alone, of grief that refused to quiet itself. And they believed, or hoped, that at Delphi, something would help them carry it. Imagine them now, a young woman with her hand pressed gently against her belly, unsure if what stirs inside her is a gift or a curse. A farmer who sold his last goat for the coin to make the journey, his heart bruised by a season of failed harvests. A warlord dressed in polished armor, but with eyes that betray a fear only the gods could unmake. They came one by one, and Delphi received them all. The approach was slow. By the time the sacred way came into view, most were already stripped of ego. The climb itself demanded humility. The path snaked upward, winding through cypress trees, each turn revealing another layer of sky. And then, there it was, Delphi, perched on the slope like a secret, its white stones glinting in the morning light. Not massive, not boastful, but alive. It did not loom like a fortress. It welcomed, softly, like a breath drawing you inward. But entry was not immediate. No one arrived and demanded an answer. There were rites. First, purification. Pilgrims would be led to the Castalian spring, a sacred source whose waters flowed cold and clear from the side of Mount Parnassus. They would kneel and wash. Hands, face, sometimes their entire bodies. Not to cleanse the skin, but to soften the soul. The spring had a voice of its own. A gentle, ceaseless murmur over stone. A lullaby for the weary. A reminder that even the most burdened could become light again. Then came the offering. A pinch of barley. A coil of wool. A coin. A prayer. And after that, the waiting. Some waited days. Others weeks. There was no schedule. The god chose the moment. The oracle chose the question. And the priesthood, veiled in ritual, maintained the rhythm that kept mortals and immortals from colliding too harshly. So they waited, in the shade, in the heat, in the deep, aching quiet that surrounded the temple like a second atmosphere. They spoke in low tones. They did not laugh loudly. Some wept openly. Others stared into the horizon, clutching the question they had traveled so far to ask. Not all questions were grand. Will my daughter survive the winter? Will the man I love return from the sea? Should I plant wheat or barley? Some came with politics, some with philosophy, but most came with hearts cracked just wide enough to let the sacred in. They were not fools. They knew the oracle would not give them a map. They knew the answer might confuse more than clarify, but still they came, because even confusion, when it is spoken in a holy place, feels blessed. Even a riddle, when offered by the divine, feels like direction. And so they waited, and when their name was called, not with pomp, but with the simplicity of ritual, they rose. They passed beneath the arch. Their shadow stretched along ancient stones, each one worn by centuries of longing. They entered the Adyton, not with fear, but with trembling awe. There the air was thick, with laurel, with smoke, with breath. The oracle sat above the chasm, already waiting, already listening, and finally the question would rise. A whisper, a thought, a cry, and from the depths of the earth, an answer, or something like it. And when they stepped back into the light, the sun brighter than they remembered, their feet unsteady with the weight of what had been spoken, they did not look back, because Delphi never offered certainty. It offered only a mirror, fogged at the edges, but clear enough to glimpse one's own reflection, more vast, more terrible, more sacred than expected. And so they walked again, back down the mountain, back into the world, sandals worn thinner still, but this time not chasing a word, carrying one, and sometimes that was enough. She never shouted. The Pythia, wrapped in vapor and laurel, never raised her voice to command, and yet her words echoed across continents. No crown was placed, no war was waged, no temple was built without someone first asking her, "Should I?" It is one of the strangest truths in history that kings, whose words could move armies, would climb barefoot to Delphi and kneel before a woman swaying in trance, because Delphi did not flatter. It did not bend to gold or lineage. It spoke only what rose from the earth, and sometimes that truth was sharp enough to cut through dynasties. They feared her, and yet they could not turn away. The Pythia's voice could topple a throne, but it never did so directly, never in the language of command. It spoke in mirrors, in riddles, in soft contradictions, and that was the danger. The most famous riddle ever uttered at Delphi was also the most devastating. The story begins with a name, Croesus, a man of immense wealth, the king of Lydia. His palace floors glittered with gold dust. His nights were illuminated not by firelight, but by walls adorned in silver and ivory. But no wealth can silence uncertainty. And so he came to Delphi, seeking clarity. He had a question, simple in shape, heavy in consequence. Should I wage war against the Persian Empire? The oracle did not answer yes or no. Instead, the Pythia inhaled the sacred vapors and spoke. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Croesus smiled. He took it as blessing, confirmation. He crossed the river, and indeed, an empire fell. His own. It is said that when he returned, ragged, defeated, stripped of wealth and men, he asked the oracle why she had betrayed him. But Delphi had not lied. She had simply reflected. The oracle did not reveal outcomes. She revealed the consequences of assumptions. Croesus assumed he knew which empire was meant to fall. He heard what he wanted to hear, and the gods remained silent. He was not the first to fall at the feet of Delphi's riddles. Kings came with armies in their eyes, and left with sand in their mouths. Themistocles, the Athenian general, came during the Persian invasion. He asked how Athens might be saved, and the oracle said, "Only the wooden walls shall remain." Some took it to mean the wooden palisades around the city. But Themistocles heard something else. Ships. He evacuated Athens, placed his faith in the navy, and lured the Persians into a narrow strait where their numbers meant nothing. Greece was saved. By a metaphor, Delphi rarely offered certainty. It offered possibility, and that is what made it so powerful and so perilous. It forced kings, men built on control, hierarchy, and force, to confront ambiguity. And ambiguity, in the hands of God, is the most precise blade of all. But there was more than prophecy at work here. There was theater. Delphi understood the power of performance. The temple, the mist, the sacred geometry, the trembling of the Pythia's voice. Half in this world, half beyond it. It wasn't just about what she said. It was about how it arrived. In fragments, in fever, like the voice of the earth breaking through the ribcage of a woman. Even emperors paused. Even Caesar. Julius came to Delphi once, before his name grew large enough to bend nations. He was turned away, told to return another day. But he pressed forward, ignoring the ritual. And the oracle, still half in trance, reportedly muttered, "You are no longer mortal." A phrase as ambiguous as it was dangerous. He left with a sense of destiny. And we all know how that ended. Because destiny, once believed, is difficult to unmake. And Delphi's greatest power was not in foretelling the future. but in planting the seed of belief. A man who believes himself blessed by the gods will walk into the fire. A man who believes his empire is fated to rise will sacrifice everything to make it true. And Delphi never forced anyone's hand. It simply pointed vaguely and let them draw their own sword. That is why kings kept coming, not for answers, but for permission. And Delphi gave it, in riddles, in whispers, in the shape of words that carried more than meaning. They carried weight. And even now, millennia later, we feel it when we stand before a choice, when we ache for a sign, when we whisper to the stars for guidance, and interpret dreams as omens. We still want a voice, a whisper, a sentence that might spare us the pain of uncertainty. But the truth is, Delphi never spared anyone. It offered no comfort, only reflection. The Pythia did not save kingdoms. She reminded them that nothing, no throne, no crown, no empire, was immune to the laws of fate. And tonight, as your breath softens and your thoughts drift like embers in the dark, perhaps you feel it too. That gentle weight of your own questions. Not grand, not imperial, but personal. And perhaps, in the silence between words, you'll hear something rise from your own chasm. A sentence, not from a god, but from within. And it may not make sense. Not now, not fully, but it may guide you. And that is enough. It begins in stillness, not silence, because silence is the absence of sound, and Delphi is never truly silent. There is always a whisper, a rustle, a wind curling through columns like a breath too ancient to stop. But there is stillness, a deep, living stillness, the kind that comes just before something begins. And in that stillness, she waits. The Pythia, she has risen before the sun, bathed in the water of the Castalian spring, where the rocks shine with a silver sheen just beneath the surface. She is dressed in white linen, simple, loose, untouched by vanity. Her hair is bound with laurel, not a crown, but a communion, each leaf plucked from trees sacred to Apollo, each vein a thread woven between worlds. And now she is alone, in the Ataton, the deepest chamber, hidden behind veils and walls, where no sunlight dares to reach, where the stone is cool and the air thick with breath not her own. Here, the sacred chasm yawns gently, a slit in the earth, not violent, not dramatic, just open. From it rises something you cannot see, only feel. It moves through the room like an animal without form. Slow, invisible, ancient. This is not the breath of air. This is the pneuma, the divine vapor. She kneels beside it. Her hands do not tremble. Not yet. There is a calm to this moment. The kind of calm that belongs to people who are about to disappear. She reaches into a clay bowl. Inside are leaves, green, narrow, pungent. Laurel. She takes one, places it on her tongue. Chews. The bitterness is sharp. The taste spreads quickly. Earthy, astringent, strangely cold. The ancients believed laurel was the tree of prophecy. Its smoke cleansed, its leaves protected, its essence opened doors no mortal should walk through alone. And as she swallows, she feels the shift, not like thunder, more like a tide. Something inside begins to change, as if her ribs are no longer bone, but branches, as if her breath is no longer her own, but borrowed from some deeper mouth beneath the mountain. She climbs the tripod now. 3 legs. Bronze. Sacred. It is not a throne. It is not comfortable. It is a threshold. Her feet rest above the chasm. The vapor kisses her soles. Her eyes close. And then she lets go. No one knows exactly what happens next. Some say she trembles. Others say she chants. Some say her body twists. that her voice becomes unrecognizable, like wind moving through a hollow reed. But there is no violence in her, only absence. She is no longer thinking, no longer remembering who she was before this moment. Not a daughter, not a woman, not even a name, only mouth. The god speaks through her now, or the earth, or the serpent. No one can say. What rises from her lips are not answers. They are images, symbols, sounds half-formed and heavy with meaning. Priests gather the fragments. They write quickly. They do not interrupt, because this is holy. This is the sound of the divine moving through flesh. Not like lightning, like breath. It does not last long. A few minutes, maybe less. The pneuma never lingers. It comes like a wave, crashes through her, then recedes. When it is gone, she slumps forward. Sweat beads at her hairline. Her mouth tastes of ash and laurel. Her body is heavy, as if it has just returned from some high, distant place. She is human again, but changed. There is a cost to this communion. Some Pythias wept after prophecy. Others laughed uncontrollably, not from joy, but from the strange sensation of being returned to a body they no longer recognized. There are stories of Pythias who could not speak for days after a trance, who wandered the sanctuary in silence, eyes wide, touching the walls as if to remember what was real. But she recovers. She always does. She steps down. She drinks water. She is wrapped in wool. And outside in the temple courtyard, a questioner waits. A king. A farmer. A mother. The priests approach him with a scroll. Upon it, riddles. Images. A puzzle of words born from mist and trance. He will read it. He will misunderstand it. He will carry it back to his city as if it were fire stolen from the gods. But the oracle, she remains behind, not triumphant, not exalted, still, quiet, and very, very tired. She has entered the mist and returned, and though no one will ever know exactly what she saw, her body remembers. Her breath is slower. Her voice is softer, because when the gods speak through you, something is always taken, and something is always left behind. Perhaps that is the true prophecy, not the riddle, not the phrase etched into stone, but the woman herself, sitting above the earth's mouth, wrapped in laurel and ash, disappearing for a moment into a space where no one else can follow, and returning, alive. Not every moment in Delphi was filled with words. Not every day echoed with prophecy. Not every breath held meaning. Not every visitor left with an answer. Sometimes the god said nothing, and that was often when he was closest. We like to imagine the divine as loud. Trumpets, visions, fire. A spectacle. But Apollo is different. He is the god of light, yes. Of music, of medicine, of prophecy. But he is also the god of restraint, of silence, of stillness. And perhaps that is what made Delphi so powerful. Because Apollo did not give himself easily. He waited. He watched. And sometimes he simply let the silence speak. There were days, entire seasons, when the oracle gave no prophecy. When the tripod remained untouched, the chasm undisturbed. When the laurel withered without burning, and the priests whispered among themselves, but did not call forth the Pythia. Not because she was unworthy, not because the pilgrims were unready, but because the god had not arrived. And Delphi, for all its sacredness, never forced him. That is the great truth hidden in the folds of its myth. The god came when he chose. No offering could hurry him. No king could command him. No suffering could summon him. He came when the time was right. Not in human hours, but in divine rhythm. And in the meantime, there was silence. But this silence was not empty. It was not absence. It was presence unspoken. It hung in the temple like incense that had not yet been lit. It curled through the colonnades like a waiting breath. It settled in the hearts of pilgrims like a question without punctuation. And it taught them something most had never known: how to wait without demanding, how to believe without evidence, how to kneel before a God who might not speak and still listen. Because sometimes the truest reverence is not found in receiving, but in enduring the silence. They say the priest would tell those who asked, "The God is away." A simple phrase, but it held many meanings. Some believed he had flown to the north, to the land of the Hyperboreans, his paradise of eternal sunlight and song. There he rested. There he was free from the weight of mortal questions. Others believed he had descended into shadow, listening to the echoes of time not yet born. Perhaps he was watching. Perhaps he was grieving. And some believed he was simply waiting, because prophecy, like music, is not only made of notes. It is made of pauses, of the space between, of the breath before the bow meets the string. And Apollo, being the god of the lyre, knew this. He knew that without silence, there is no song. Without absence, no presence is felt. So Delphi became a place not only of revelation, but of readiness. People learned to kneel in stillness, to leave their questions not on the tongue, but in the hands of time. There are stories, quiet ones, hidden between louder legends, of pilgrims who came to Delphi seeking prophecy and left without it. No voice, no riddle, no vision, only silence. And yet, some of them returned home changed, because in that silence they felt something shift, something subtle, a loosening of the knots inside them, a warmth beneath the ribs, as if the god, though wordless, had placed a hand on their chest and held it there. That is the kind of god Apollo was, not one who gave freely, but one who gave fully. And when he did speak, when the Pythia, trembling above the chasm, released his riddles into the world, they were not guesses, they were weight, and the world felt it. But tonight, in this soft space between stories, we do not chase his voice, we do not demand his riddle. We sit in the sacred hush, where nothing is said, and everything is heard. We breathe slowly, like the mountain, like the stone, like the god, and we remember that the divine is not always a flash of thunder. Sometimes it is a long pause before the dawn. So rest now in the quiet curve of this moment. Let the silence settle around you, not as absence, but as invitation. Apollo may not be here, or maybe he is closer than ever, not in words, but in the waiting. At night, Delphi changed. The pilgrims had drifted into sleep. The priests had extinguished the last lamps. The winds curled gently down from Mount Parnassus like sighs from the sleeping mouth of a god. And the stars, too many to count, leaned low over the sanctuary, as if watching. But the treasuries, they remained awake. Small marble structures lined the sacred way. Not temples, not houses, but treasuries, each built by a city, a people, a nation seeking favor or penance or remembrance. Each a shrine, not to a deity, but to a question once asked. To walk past them by moonlight was to pass a corridor of secrets. In the daylight, they stood in still majesty, ivory white, their friezes carved with stories of wars and oaths, gods and monsters, pride and sacrifice. But at night, they whispered, because inside, locked behind ornate bronze doors, beneath carved pediments and roof tiles worn by time, waited gifts. Thousands of them, votive offerings, sacred artifacts, coins stacked like small prayers, tripods, figurines, necklaces once worn by priestesses, now resting in velvet darkness. And all of them hummed, softly, not in sound, but in presence. Because objects remember. A gold goblet offered by a general before battle still carries the heat of his hand. A carved ivory horse still dreams of the daughter for whom it was given. Even the dullest coin bears the quiet pressure of someone's hope. Each treasury held not just wealth, but memory. And at night, those memories awoke. Not like ghosts, not to haunt, but to breathe. Inside the treasury of the Athenians, the moonlight filtered through narrow slits in the stone. It fell across shields offered in gratitude for victories at sea, across the edge of a spear that never struck a man, but had been blessed for protection, across amphories still scented with the faded trace of oil used in ritual, thick, sacred, kissed by flame. There were no guards here, not because there was no danger, but because theft was unthinkable. To steal from Delphi was to curse your soul, not with thunder or plague, but with disconnection. You would no longer be heard by the gods. Your prayers would rise and find only silence. And so, the treasuries remained untouched century after century, preserved by reverence, not by chains. Some believe the offerings were strategic propaganda in marble form. Cities trying to outshine one another. Athens showing Sparta its gold. Corinth displaying its artistry. But that explanation misses something essential. Because when the world slept and the sanctuary grew still, these gifts became something else. They became a chorus, not of ambition, but of yearning. Each object sang softly of the hand that placed it. Each bore the fingerprint of an individual moment. A father's fear, a widow's promise, a sailor's plea for wind. And they didn't fade, because faith, once given, does not vanish. It lingers. Even now, if you were to slip into one of those treasuries, barefoot, unseen, as the stars bloomed overhead, you might feel it, the hush, the weight, the soft sense that you are not alone, that you are walking among questions, old ones, quiet ones, never fully answered. Some say that at night, when the Pythias slept, when Apollo's breath lay dormant in the chasm, the gods walked among the offerings, not to take, not to bless, but to listen, as if even the divine needed to be reminded of what it means to hope. And maybe that is what Delphi was at its core. Not a place of answers, but a place to place things. Fears, gratitude, love too large to hold, pain too heavy to name. You didn't have to carry it anymore. You could leave it in bronze, in gold, in clay, in the hands of the mountain, and it would be held forever. So tonight, as you lie beneath your own ceiling, wrapped in your own silence, know this. You, too, carry offerings, not coins, not crowns, but memories, longings, questions pressed quietly against the inside of your ribs. And maybe you can lay one down now, not in a temple, not in stone, but in the soft space of your breath. Let it go, and trust that somewhere beneath marble and myth, a god is listening. They came for answers. Kings, poets, mothers, scholars, begging the same thing, wrapped in different forms. Tell me the truth. But the truth at Delphi never arrived naked. It arrived wrapped in layers, whispered, bent sideways like moonlight slipping through reeds. Never direct, never absolute, because the gods, they say, do not speak as we do. They do not offer facts. They offer fragments, symbols, riddles, echoes, not to confuse, but because the truth, when whole, is too vast to be held by the human tongue. And so, it must wear a mask. In Delphi, truth arrived disguised, sometimes as metaphor, sometimes as contradiction, sometimes as silence. And the mask was not a deception. It was a form of mercy, for to see the full truth, naked, blazing, final, would break the mind. And so the god veiled it. A veil of poetry, of ambiguity, of half-sung verses that sounded like madness to some and salvation to others. We call these prophecies, but they were never predictions. They were invitations to listen differently, to think beyond the edges, to sit with uncertainty as a sacred companion. Take, for example, the prophecy given to King Laius of Thebes. You will have a son who will kill you and marry his mother. A cruel, impossible riddle, and yet true. Laius, desperate to escape fate, abandoned the child. But that very act set the wheel turning. The boy, Oedipus, grew without knowing his lineage. He fled a home that was not his, killed a stranger who was, and married a queen whose blood ran in his veins. The prophecy fulfilled, not because it was read, but because it was misunderstood. That is the danger of Delphi's truth. It gives no map, only a mirror. And what you see in that mirror depends on where you're standing. Many left Delphi convinced they had heard what they wanted. The Pythia had spoken, the god had revealed, but often the prophecy did not reveal the world. It revealed the seeker, because when you are told a great empire will fall, it matters what empire you imagine. It matters what river you cross. It matters what question lived in your chest before you ever asked it aloud. Delphi did not twist truth. It reflected it, distorted only by the gaze of the one looking in. Like a pool of water in a cave. You stare into it. You see a face, but the face moves. It shimmers. It breaks and ripples. Is it yours? Is it the gods? Or is it something older, looking back? That was the mystery. That was the gift. Not knowing, but learning to live within the not knowing. Learning to carry a riddle not as a burden, but as a torch, because riddles light things we never knew were there. They awaken new thoughts, new roads, new parts of the soul that would never have stirred had we been handed an answer. And perhaps that was Apollo's truest intention, not to reveal your fate, but to wake you, to make you feel the weight of your choices, to remind you that clarity is not the same as wisdom, and that sometimes the question you came with was never the question that mattered. So the gods spoke in riddles, because only riddles survive. Only riddles remain open, shifting, breathing, and long after the oracle fell silent, long after the empire turned to ash, the riddles lived on, etched in stone, scribbled in scrolls, told in whispers beside fires. They became part of the human mind, and still we return to them, not to solve them, but to sit with them, to lean into their mystery, to let their veils wrap around us, soft as mist, warm as breath, honest in their refusal to be pinned down. Because truth, they say, wears veils, not to hide, but to protect. And when it is ready, when you are ready, the veil may lift. Not all at once, not completely, just enough for a glimpse, a shimmer, a thread, a breath. And in that glimpse, in that sacred fraction of vision, you may finally understand that the answer was never the goal. It was the journey into the unknown, the listening, the questioning, the softening of certainty into wonder. And that is truth enough. Even the oldest stories begin with something real, a breeze, a shadow, a tremble in the soil. And over centuries, those things grow, coiled by memory, wrapped in metaphor, crowned with godlight, until they become legend. But even beneath the most sacred myths, there is always a root, something true, something that moves not in verse or vision, but in rock. Delphi was never just holy. It was also geological, and long after the gods grew silent, long after the oracles stopped speaking, the mountain remained, still exhaling, still humming, and someone, centuries later, would ask not, what did Apollo say? But what was that sound? It began with the ground, Mount Parnassus, you see, is not just a mountain. It is a fault line, a place where the earth has cracked and shifted and remembered her own force. Delphi rests on the intersection of two tectonic veins, like a heartbeat beneath the stone. And from that pulse, something rises. Gas. Invisible. Silent. Soft as breath. For centuries, the Pythia sat above the sacred chasm, inhaling what she believed to be the god's essence. And in a way, she wasn't wrong, because from the earth below her tripod rose a cocktail of gases. Today we name them ethylene, methane, benzene, chemicals carried on subterranean wind, leaking through porous limestone, rising like prophecy. In small doses, they open the mind. They make the body loose. The world slow. The border between thought and vision dissolve. They do not show you the future, but they can make you see differently. And the oracle, she breathed it in, not once, not as a ritual, but every time she entered trance. Her breath slowed, her voice transformed, her body swaying not from madness, but from molecular reaction. She did not know the name of the gas. She only knew the feeling, the soft flutter in the spine, the hush of time peeling away, the warmth inside her chest, like someone lighting a small fire behind her ribs. Was it divine? Perhaps. Because what is divinity, if not the meeting place of awe and reality? And here, they met. The geology of Delphi, the fissures, the heat, the pressurized earth, was not a trick. It was a channel, a natural cathedral, stone and vapor in communion. The god did not descend from the sky. He rose from the core. The ancients, of course, knew nothing of gases. They had no words for hydrocarbons or plate boundaries. But they had sensation. They felt the mountain breathing. They saw the visions. They heard the voice in the cave. And they named it Apollo. Not because they misunderstood, but because they saw clearly in a way we've forgotten how to. They didn't need to prove the science. They lived within the mystery. And maybe that's what modern minds miss. We think explanation must kill wonder. But at Delphi, it enhances it, because now we know the god's voice was real. His breath had chemical composition. His sanctuary sat on a living mouth of earth. And still, the mystery remains, because even knowing the gas, even mapping the fault lines, even measuring the chasm's depth, does not explain what she saw. The Pythia, eyes glazed, mouth open, words spilling out like fragments from a broken star. No machine has ever decoded what lives inside a vision. No scientist can measure the heat of faith, because truth, as always, has layers. Delphi is a place where science and myth do not argue. They touch hands. The chasm is both a geological fissure and the belly of Gaia. The vapor is both ethylene and Apollo's breath. The oracle is both a woman affected by neurochemistry and the mouthpiece of the divine. Both. Always both. And isn't that, in the end, more beautiful? To know that the ground beneath us is not just stone, but story. To know that the God is not undone by knowledge. He is revealed by it, like flame behind stained glass, like breath behind a veil. So tonight, as your own breath slows, as the weight of the day slips quietly from your shoulders, let yourself imagine that beneath the bed where you lie, beneath the floor, beneath the roots, beneath the rock, the earth is still dreaming. And sometimes, when the wind is still and your body is soft with sleep, you might feel her breath rise through you, not to predict, not to instruct, but simply to remind you that you are part of the fire, part of the story, part of the mystery that never ends. Delphi was not alone. It is easy to believe it was. So much myth gathers here. So many prophecies. So many kings. So many golden offerings cradled in shadow. That Delphi feels like the center of all sacred sound. But it was not the only voice in the wilderness. The ancient world was a landscape not just of cities and seas, but of oracles, sanctuaries where the veil thinned, where gods murmured through women, trees, stones, birds, and flame. And to walk through that world was to walk through a map made not of lines, but of echoes. Each oracle was different. Each had its own god, its own breath, its own way of listening, but together they formed a constellation of questions, a soft, sacred web stretched across time. One of the oldest lived far to the north and west, in Dodona, where the wind whispered through the leaves of a great oak tree. Their Zeus spoke not through mist, but through rustling. The priests and priestesses of Dodona would sit beneath the tree, listening as the wind moved the leaves, a sound not unlike rain in a dry forest, a voice made of movement, no gas, no trance, just ears sharpened by stillness. The answers came slowly, like ripples on water, and those who asked questions had to first learn to listen, not with impatience, but with devotion, because the oak did not shout. It sighed, and that sigh carried truth. Then there was Claros, where Apollo also spoke, but not in riddles. Here, the priest would descend into a sacred cave and drink from a spring so cold it made the teeth ache. The water, they said, unlocked something. It stripped away pretense. It dulled the senses of the world and opened others. And in that altered state, the priest would speak, not in fragments, but in full oration, long poetic phrases that emerged not from thought, but from surrender. In Didyma, the sanctuary was grand, built for majesty. Its temple columns rose like petrified flames. The oracle there spoke to both kings and the curious. She did not need a chasm, only rhythm, incense, time. But still, she was believed to hold the breath of Apollo. Then there were smaller oracles, flickering embers compared to Delphi's flame, sacred caves, springs that shimmered with strange colors, statues that bled or blinked under the moonlight. In remote villages, a shepherd might point to a peculiar rock and say, "My grandfather heard the gods here." And who's to say he was wrong? Because sacredness is not measured in crowds. It's measured in presence. And every oracle, no matter how quiet, held something the world still aches for. A moment when something answers. But among them all, Delphi remained singular. Why? Was it the setting? A temple carved into the shoulder of a mountain, overlooking a valley that stretched like a sigh toward the sea? Was it the vapor? The trance? The riddle? Or was it something less explainable? A quality of attention, a weight of silence, a sacredness that deepened with every century of breathless waiting? Delphi was not louder than the others. It was deeper. Its words did not instruct. They echoed, and even the other oracles seemed to defer to it, as if they, too, were satellites orbiting its stillness. Pilgrims who had visited Dodona often made their way to Delphi, as if one question was not enough, as if only through a series of voices could the truth be triangulated. But there were those who said, "Go to Dodona if you wish to hear the leaves, but come to Delphi if you are ready to hear yourself." Because in the end, Delphi never told you what to do. It let you reveal what you had always feared to know. It did not deliver truth like a letter. It drew it from you, like a thread from a tapestry you never knew you were weaving. The other oracles offered guidance. Delphi offered mirrors, and sometimes that was the heavier gift, because mirrors do not console. They confront. Yet even so, pilgrims returned. They came back with new questions, new fears, new wounds, but they came. Because once you've heard the voice in the stone, once you've felt the weight of being witnessed, not by a person, but by the sacred itself, Nothing else is ever quite the same. And so tonight, as you lie in your own temple of quiet breath, your body wrapped in shadow and hush, perhaps you can feel it too. The chorus of voices, the oak leaves in Dodona, the spring in Claros, the flame in Didyma, and Delphi, the still center around which they all circle. Each oracle a doorway, each breath a bridge, each silence a god waiting. And within you, the one question that's always been yours, still glowing, still pulsing, still waiting to be asked. They say that those who come to Delphi come with open hands, but not all hands are open. Some are clenched, gripping tightly to the answers they've already chosen, hoping the god will simply agree. And Delphi does not bend to hope. This is the story of a man who could not bear uncertainty. A king, a warrior, a ruler carved from pride and need. His name is lost, or perhaps it was never spoken aloud, for fear of invoking his fate once more. But the story remains. He arrived at Delphi in early spring, when the laurel trees were just beginning to blossom, and the mountain mist still kissed the valley floor each morning. He came not alone. There were horses, attendants, guards dressed in bronze. A trail of dust followed his caravan like a second shadow. He carried gold, ivory, a golden chain to lay upon the temple altar. But what he truly brought, what weighed down every step, was a question. A single question. Should I go to war? He spoke it softly, yet his voice trembled with something too loud to name. The desire not just to be answered, but to be justified. The priests accepted his offering. They performed the rites. And soon, the Pythia was summoned. She climbed a tripod, inhaled the sacred breath, disappeared into the mist. And when she spoke, her voice was not hers. It floated. It fractured. It became the god. If you go to war, your enemies will fall beneath you like grain beneath the sickle. Your name will echo across the sea. The king smiled, his hands open wide, not in gratitude, but in victory already imagined. He bowed, left his offerings, and turned his back on the mountain. But something festered. Days passed, then nights, and the prophecy, so sweet in the moment, began to itch at the corners of his mind. What did she mean by grain? What if his enemies changed their alliances? What if the gods were mocking him? He began to question the god's tone, the phrasing, the pauses. He paced in his chamber long after midnight, the words spinning like a net around his certainty. He returned to Delphi, not out of faith, out of fear. And fear, they say, is the one thing the oracle cannot soothe. He came in secret, this time with fewer attendants, dressed in humility, as if costume could cleanse his intent. The priests were hesitant. It was not customary to return so soon. The god had already spoken, but gold softens resistance. And so, she climbed the tripod again. This time, she did not smile. The vapors rose. The mist thickened. The Pythia's breath slowed. And then came the voice. You asked once and did not listen. You ask again and hear nothing. Silence. No elaboration. No riddle. No comfort. Only a cold sentence that landed like frost on fire. The king left, his head bowed. He did not go to war, nor did he return home. He wandered, they say, through borderlands, through villages where no one knew his name. Stripped of direction, his power unraveled not by battle, but by doubt. He had sought permission and received a mirror, and when the mirror cracked, he saw nothing. This is the danger of asking twice. Not because the god punishes you, but because you have already stopped listening. Delphi is not a place for certainty. It is a place where the veil lifts briefly, just long enough to show you the shape of your question. And when you ask again, you're no longer asking the god. You're asking your fear. And fear does not answer. It consumes. There is a saying among the old priests of Delphi, spoken only to those who linger too long by the temple gates. If you cannot bear the answer, do not ask twice, because the second answer is not kinder. It is clearer, and clarity is often colder than we hoped. Still, the king's story remains, not as a warning, but as a kind of prayer, a prayer for the courage to hear what we do not want to hear, to trust that the first whisper may be enough, to believe that the God, when he speaks, speaks not to flatter, but to reveal. And sometimes, the most sacred thing we can do is to ask our question once, and then walk away. Tonight, you are far from temples, but perhaps not so far from Delphi. If you have a question in your heart, let it rise. Whisper it once, softly, into the dark, and then leave space. A space wide enough for the answer to arrive. Or not, because sometimes the God speaks only once, and the echo is yours to carry. You don't need to believe in gods to feel the sacred in Delphi. You only need to walk slowly, barefoot if possible, letting your feet touch what remains, letting your breath fall into rhythm with the hush of the place. Because long after the gods stopped speaking, the stones began to. They do not speak in language. They do not answer questions, but they remember, and their memory is longer than myth, deeper than legend, more faithful than parchment or scroll. Marble remembers. It remembers the footsteps of the seekers, the calluses of kings, the soft tread of priests and slaves alike. It remembers laughter, yes, even here. It remembers the weeping of a mother who received no answer, the soft exhale of a Pythia returning from trance, barely able to stand. It remembers the weight of offerings, coins, figurines, gifts placed with trembling hands, fingers lingering longer than necessary, as if trying to press grief directly into the stone. And those centuries have passed, and vines now grow between the broken flagstones. The marble does not forget, because marble, they say, is alive. Not like a tree, not like a flame, but like the sky, unchanging in its silence, but always present. If you sit long enough beside a ruin, if your body stills, if your thoughts soften like clay before water, you may begin to feel it, a vibration, faint, steady, like breath trapped in the spine of the earth. You are not imagining it. Delphi is still breathing. The columns may be broken, the temple roofless, the statues faceless, but the meaning never left, because the stones were never just structure. They were always part of the ritual. Each block, each stair, each chipped altar, placed with hands that prayed as they worked. The architecture was not built to impress. It was built to guide, upward, inward, toward the god. Even a path you walk, the sacred way, was never meant to be rushed. It winds on purpose, each step drawing you closer, each turn offering a new perspective. And now, centuries later, you walk the same stones. Only now, the god is gone. The voices are silent. The altar is cracked, but the presence remains. Not loud, not obvious, but steady. The stones speak not in answers, but in reminders. They remind you that nothing sacred is ever truly lost, only transformed. The oracle no longer sits at her tripod, but you sit now, in your quiet room, in your quiet night, listening. Is that not the same? A sacred posture, a stillness, a willingness to hear what the world does not shout. The Pythia once breathed mist. You breathe darkness. You breathe memory. And it is enough, because Delphi was never about the god. It was about the relationship between the seeker and the place, the question and the silence, the foot and the stone. And stone remembers every foot that has touched it, even yours. So walk slowly. Let the marble teach you. Let your body feel the heat trapped in old stone, sunlight from another century. Let your hand rest on a wall that once held incense, once held the shadow of prophecy. You are not touching ruin. You are touching resonance. And resonance is eternal. Some say that when you sleep near the ruins of Delphi, your dreams change, that the stones, having held so many hopes, begin to offer some of their own. Not visions, not prophecies, just images. Laurel leaves floating down a stream. A woman's hand raised to the sun. A staircase leading down into mist. The stones do not explain. They do not instruct. They simply echo. An echo is how memory survives. So tonight, as you lie still beneath the weight of your own thoughts, know that you are held, not by gods, not by answers, but by place. A place that has waited millennia for someone to listen. Not with ears, but with presence. And now you are listening, and the stones are singing. Beneath the gold, beneath the smoke, beneath the legend, was always a woman. Not a statue, not a symbol, not a disembodied voice hovering in vapor, but a woman with a heartbeat and lungs that filled with mountain air, and hands that curled into themselves in sleep, and skin that bruised. The Pythia, they called her the voice of Apollo, but she did not arrive as a goddess. She was chosen, and that choosing, so many believe, was sacred, divine. But rarely do we speak of what it meant to be chosen. The long hours in silence, the fasting, the separation, to become the voice of the god. She had to first lose the sound of her own. They stripped away her name. She became the Pythia, not a name, but a role, a channel, a vessel. But vessels, too, are made of clay, and clay breaks. Imagine her before the trance, before the breath of Apollo passed through her like wind through the cracks in a temple wall. She stands barefoot at the edge of the Ataton. She breathes deeply, not as a prophet, but as a woman. Her ribs rise, her shoulders fall, and she waits for the god to arrive. But what if, just for a moment, he doesn't? What if there are days when the mist doesn't come? When her voice catches in her throat? When her mind, so trained to empty itself, refuses to still? What if the god is silent? And what if in that silence, she remembers who she was before all this? A girl with earth beneath her fingernails. A daughter who sang to goats at dusk. A woman who once touched another's hand and felt her own heart wake. They say the trance took her, but they do not say where. Was a holy place? Or a hollow one? Did she feel full of light? Or emptied of herself? We do not know, because the Pythia never told her own story. Every word she spoke was claimed by the god. Every riddle attributed to his breath. But there must have been moments, between trances, between questioners, in the middle of the night when the stone walls echoed her name back to her. When she remembered she was more than a mouthpiece. She was a body. She was fatigued. She was longing. And she carried it all, silently, beautifully, devoutly. The world remembers the god, but she bore him, and that bearing had a cost. Some Pythias served for a year, some for a decade, but all of them aged faster than time allowed. The trance wears down the bone. The sacred breath, sweet as it was, burns the throat. And the questions, so many questions, sink into the skin like weight. Should I marry him? Will the plague take my son? Do the gods forgive me? Each one a stone she carried. And still, she gave herself. Not for glory, not for wealth, but because something inside her, some quiet, unnameable thread, had once said yes. Yes to being opened. Yes to being entered. Yes to becoming the space through which mystery might pass. They crowned her in laurel, but they never asked what she saw when her eyes rolled back. And maybe that's the truest loss. Not the fall of Delphi, not the crumbling of the temple, but the forgetting of her, of the woman beneath the god, of the one who offered herself to be the instrument of something far larger. and never once asked for recognition. Tonight, in the hush of your own breath, perhaps you can feel her, not as a legend, not as an oracle, but as a soul, resting her head against the cool marble wall, closing her eyes as the stars wheel overhead, and whispering just once, not a prophecy, but a prayer of her own, not to Apollo, not to Gaia, not to the serpent, but to herself, a whisper for rest, for return, for softness. So let us honor her tonight, not with incense, not with riddles, but with remembrance. Let us remember the woman beneath the god, and let us sleep as she never could, free of voices, free of weight, held not by destiny, but by peace. There are endings that roar, and there are endings that whisper. Delphi's end did neither. It simply stopped, not with a collapse, not with a scream, but with a breath held and never released. The god did not fall. He withdrew, like tide retreating from shore, like sunlight fading through the cypress leaves, until only shadow remained. And still, for a time, the people came, long after the temples began to crack, long after the marble faded from white to bone, long after the Pythia fell silent. They still climbed the sacred way, not in hope, but in habit, in reverence, because something sacred does not die. It simply quietly ceases to answer. No one knows the final prophecy. There is no last riddle carved into stone, no tablet marking the end, only stories. Some say the last Pythia was old, her hands gnarled like olive branches, her eyes pale with visions too heavy to hold. They say she climbed the tripod one final time, inhaled the sacred vapor, but no voice came, only her breath. And then, not even that. Others say that God himself announced his departure, that one day, the Pythia rose and spoke not to a king, not to a pilgrim, but to the temple itself. Tell the people the house has fallen. The god no longer lives here. And with that, he vanished. Apollo, bringer of light, slayer of Python, speaker of riddles, was gone. No fire, no ash, only silence. But the silence was not empty. It was full of memory, of breath once spoken, of lives shaped by questions asked in that sacred air. And yet, the world changed. The old gods began to fade, not in defeat, but in retreat. Rome had risen. Christianity had bloomed like wild flame across the empire. New temples, new stories, new heavens. And the oracle stood in their shadow. The Christians called her demonic, or deluded. They stripped the sanctuary of meaning, scattered the statues, left the columns to the mercy of wind and moss. They declared the god dead, but still the mountain remained. Still the chasm breathed. Still the laurel grew, and still something whispered there, though now only the trees knew how to listen. Some say the last Pythia did not die in trance, that she walked away, down the mountain, back to the sea, back to a life unimagined. She lived among fishermen, a quiet woman with distant eyes and strange dreams. They say she never spoke of the god, but some nights when the wind curled off the waves, she would light a single candle, press laurel to her lips, and whisper to the dark, not prophecy, just remembrance. Because how do you mourn a voice that shaped the world? How do you bury a breath that never belonged to lungs? You don't. You let it echo, softly, quietly, through ruins, through stone, through the skin of those who still believe that mystery never truly ends. And now Delphi sleeps, but it does not sleep alone. It dreams beneath vines and ivy. It hums beneath moss. It waits in the bones of the mountain. And sometimes, when the night is very still and the stars press close, you can hear it, not the voice of Apollo, but the space where he once stood. And that space is holy, because what is more sacred than the place a god has left, where a voice once burned, But now you must listen deeper to find its warmth. Delphi's final gift was not a prophecy. It was the silence that followed. And in that silence, we learned to speak our own truths, to ask better questions, to carry uncertainty not as a wound, but as a lamp. So tonight, let the hush settle around you. Let the God fall silent. Let the question go unanswered, because now it is your voice that matters, not to command, not to predict, but simply to say, I was here, and I listened. Delphi is not just a place of sky and stone. It is a place of roots. And beneath every prophecy, beneath every temple column and chiseled word, there is something older, something darker, something softer, soil. And in that soil, bones, not of gods, but of the ones who serve them. We forget sometimes that sanctuaries are built by hands, and those hands eventually return to the ground. Not all Pythias were remembered. Most were not named. They left no inscriptions, no statues, no lineages. They lived their service, breathed their visions, and then they were buried beneath olive trees, near springs, in shadowed plots the world has long since forgotten. But the olive trees remember, because trees, like temples, carry memory, not in stories, but in growth, in rings, in sap, in how their roots bend around bone without breaking it. There is one olive tree, gnarled, silver-leaved, clinging to the slope just beneath the ruins of the temple, that is older than the columns it leans toward. No plaque, no inscription, but the villagers say it stands atop something, a stone marker, a body, a soul once filled with the voice of Apollo, now feeding the tree that holds the sky. They do not cut from this tree. They do not climb it. It is sacred in its unknowing. And that is what this chapter is for. To remember what cannot be seen. To honor the stories that were never spoken aloud. Beneath every sacred site are women whose names have faded. Not because they were unimportant, but because their lives were not lived to be recorded. They were lived to be felt. And their bodies remain. Not as relics. Not as martyrs. But as soil, as part of the mountain now. Their bones have returned to limestone, their breath to wind, their vision to root. And when the laurel leaves tremble in the breeze, when the dust swirls unexpectedly along the old temple path, when the olive tree stretches its crooked limbs toward the stars, it is not the God who stirs. It is them, the women beneath. The bodies who bore the weight of divine breath and mortal grief. The ones who spent their lives speaking what was not theirs to speak, and then fell silent without fanfare. And now they sleep, but the olive tree grows, and each year it drops its fruit like quiet offerings. Not to kings, not to temples, to the ground, to the same ground that once held them. And maybe that is the truest ritual of all. To fall, to soften, to feed what comes next. The Pythias did not leave behind dynasties, but they left roots. And roots are more enduring than marble. They hold, they bind, they remember in ways no scroll ever could. So tonight, let yourself sink into the softness, into the dark, into the loam of your own breath. You are not rising now. You are rooting. Let your body fall toward the earth. Let your mind become quiet. Let the past wrap its arms around you not in noise, but in nourishment. You are becoming part of the olive tree, part of the listening, part of the story that does not need to be told, only felt. And maybe, long after your name has faded, some branch will grow above you, and it will not speak. It will not shine, but it will reach. And that, too, is a form of prophecy. Before the answers, there was always the smoke. Not the divine vapor from the chasm, not the breath of Apollo, but our smoke. The smoke of mortals, of bark and resin, of dried laurel and crushed myrrh. burned in shallow bronze bowls as offerings to what could not be named. They would light it slowly, a priest's steady hand, a servant's trembling fingers, the strike of flint, the crackle of kindling, and then the curling, always the curling, upward, upward, upward. The smoke did not rush. It rose like thought, like a question hesitant to form, like a memory remembered too gently to speak aloud. It wove between columns. It kissed the feet of statues. It wrapped itself around the heads of questioners like a crown made of haze. And the people would watch it, even before they approached the oracle. They would sit in the temple courtyard and watch the smoke rise. Because in Delphi, smoke was not just scent. It was signal, not to the gods, to the self. It was a way of preparing, of softening, of loosening the grip we have on our questions long enough to let them change. You see, in Delphi, you did not arrive with a question as much as you became a question. And before you could ask, you had to be willing to burn something. Sometimes it was barley, sometimes cedar, sometimes a scrap of cloth from your child's first tunic, or a petal from your mother's grave. Whatever you burned, you offered it to the fire, and let the smoke carry the rest. Because that's what smoke does. It carries, without judging, without breaking. It lifts sorrow as easily as gratitude. It carries rage with the same grace it carries hope. And once it's in the air, once it's rising, it no longer belongs to you. It becomes part of the temple's breath, part of the hush. They say the temple never smelled the same twice. Each day was a new composition. Notes of pine and ash, laurel and olive, salt and sweat and summer grass. It became a living incense, shaped by the collective yearning of every soul who stepped inside. And in that scent, you could feel the weight of all the questions ever asked, like layers of dust. But holy, the smoke did not answer, but it witnessed. It moved slowly, brushing against the stone with the tenderness of something ancient. And the stone, in turn, accepted it. The columns were porous. They absorbed the years. They held the scent. Even now, if you lean your cheek against one of Delphi's ruins and close your eyes long enough, you may still feel it. That warmth, that trace, that ghost of prayer. Because the smoke did not disappear. It stayed, not in the air, in the memory of place. There is a secret among the old stonemasons of Greece. They say certain marble, if cut and shaped for temple use, begins to hold not just weight, but presence. They call it breathing stone, not because it exhales, but because it listens. And it was smoke that taught it how. Imagine that. Thousands of years, and still, the stones remember the questions that were never answered. Because smoke in Delphi was not an afterthought. It was the first part of the prophecy. It softened the space. It wrapped the fear. It blurred the edges of ego just enough for mystery to enter. So tonight, in your own quiet sanctuary, your room dim and your body still, perhaps you might imagine a small flame beside you, and from it, a curl of smoke. Let it rise. Let it carry whatever lingers in your chest. The thought you cannot name, the ache that resists words, the longing you've hidden even from yourself. Let the smoke take it, not to fix, not to solve, but to hold. Let it rise like all the ancient questions did. Soft, slow, unashamed. You do not need to answer yourself tonight. You only need to offer. And trust that, even in silence, something is listening. Before the god, before the laurel, before the voice, there was the serpent. It lived beneath the mountain, coiled in the dark, unmoving, watching. The Greeks called it Python, a creature born from Gaia, herself, not as punishment, not as threat, but as presence, a guardian, not of treasure, but of time, not of walls, but of mystery. Before Delphi became Apollo's sanctuary, it was Gaia's, and Gaia did not speak in riddles. She spoke in dreams. Her breath rose from the chasm not to reveal the future, but to awaken the memory of what already was. She gave not prophecy, but remembrance. And her priestesses, long before the god arrived, listened not through vapor, but through sleep. They lay upon the stone. They let the earth cradle their bodies. And from that touch, from the pulsing dark beneath them, visions rose like heat. The serpent was their keeper, not a monster, not an enemy, but the vessel through which the deep wisdom of the earth moved. Python did not strike. He did not hiss. He listened, and in his stillness, the world softened. He was not meant to be slain. He was meant to be honored. But then came the god. Apollo, golden-haired, radiant, crowned in music and logic. He did not slither. He strode. He did not listen. He spoke. And when he arrived, he saw the serpent not as a guardian, but as an obstacle. He raised his bow. He loosed his arrows, and the earth trembled. They say Python's death shook the mountain, that the chasm split deeper that day, that the air grew thick with something more than vapor, something like grief. But Python did not scream. He dreamed, because serpents, you see, do not die as we do. They shed, they transform, they disappear into the soil and wait for memory to curl around them once again. Some say he sleeps still, deep beneath the omphalos stone, curled around the roots of the mountain like a forgotten question, not to rise in vengeance, not to haunt, but to witness, because something was lost that day, when Apollo claimed the sanctuary, when logic replaced intuition, when riddles overtook dreams. The balance shifted. The light grew sharper, but the dark was no longer welcomed. Yet we need both. We always have. That is why Python matters still, not as a myth to be feared, but as a reminder that some wisdom does not rise with the sun. It waits in shadow. It waits in the body. It waits in the kind of silence you can only hear while sleeping. He was not the enemy of prophecy. He was its root. And in truth, Delphi was never Apollo's alone. It was shared. Every time the oracle inhaled the vapor, every time her eyes drifted into trance, she entered the serpent's space. Even as the god whispered through her lips, it was Python's breath that carried the words. So who really spoke? Was it Apollo, or the serpent he tried to silence? Was it the god of reason, or the memory of the earth herself? Perhaps both, because Delphi has always existed in between light and shadow, above and below, certainty and dream. And Python was the dream. So tonight, as you slip deeper into the hush of your own breath, let your mind become a coil. Let it spiral. Let it soften. There is nothing to fear in the dark. Only memory. Only myth. And somewhere in that stillness, beneath the folds of your thoughts, a serpent dreams of you, not to devour, but to protect. And if you listen closely, you may feel him move, not with malice, but with meaning. Because before the god gave answers, the serpent offered sleep. And sometimes, sleep is the truest prophecy of all. The temple still stands, not whole, not proud, but present. Ruined, yes, but not ruined in the way we use that word. It is not a place broken by time. It is a place opened by it, and within it lies the Adaton, the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, a chamber not meant to be seen, only felt. Few entered it, even in Delphi's golden days. Only the Pythia, only the priests, only those who could bear to listen without interpreting too quickly. Now, the roof is gone. The shadows have grown longer. The floor is cracked. The stones sweat at dawn. And the Adaton is empty, but is not abandoned. Because some places, once inhabited by the sacred, never fully return to ordinary space. They remain hollow, but alive, like the inside of a conch shell. Quiet, yes, but still echoing the sea. The hollow in the stone still holds the shape of the tripod. The dust still bears the faint imprint of bare feet. The air is cooler there, as if memory itself has weight. And though no one speaks in this space anymore, you can feel the thickness of words once spoken. It is a listening place, and if you sit there long enough, you begin to understand that emptiness is not the opposite of presence. It is the form that presence takes, when it no longer needs to speak aloud. The hollow in the stone is not void. It is reverberation. It holds the sigh of the oracle before she inhaled, the crumbling sound of her body returning to itself after trance, the almost imperceptible thrum of the earth beneath her. And it holds more than sound. It holds grief, not loud, not bitter, but the grief of surrender, the kind that comes when something larger than yourself moves through you and then leaves. It holds the weight of her service, her exhaustion, her silence, because the God may have spoken through her, but it was she who bore the cost. And the stone remembers. It cradled her bones when she trembled. It drank her tears. It listened to the answers she could never keep. And now, without her, without incense, without golden gifts or waiting crowds, the stone still listens, not out of duty, but out of love. Because when you have been the vessel of so much longing, so many unspoken fears, so many aching questions passed from lips to air to mystery, you do not forget. The hollow in the stone is a womb, not a tomb. It is the space from which vision was once born, and still could be if someone were to enter with the right stillness. Not a question, not a demand, just a presence. Because some answers do not rise from the lips of God. They rise from the absence of sound, from the breath caught in the throat just before the truth is spoken, from the moment just after the oracle finishes, and no one dares to move, from the hollow, the center, the empty place that echoes with everything it once held. And that is enough. That is prophecy now, not words, but space. So tonight, as you sink deeper into sleep, imagine this: a temple long quiet, a chamber of cracked stone, an invisible breath moving through the hollowness. No voices, no riddles, only you and the space inside you. That listens, the hollow beneath your ribs, the soft well behind your thoughts. That is your Ataton now, and if you are quiet enough, you may hear something rise from it, not from God, but from yourself. And when it does, you won't need to understand it. You'll only need to hold it, as the stone once held her, as the earth once held the fire, as Delphi still holds the silence. Delphi remembers the names of kings, of generals, of city-states carved into marble, their pride still echoing in ruined treasuries. But what are the others? The girl who came barefoot from a village no one mapped, the shepherd who offered his only coin, the mother who walked for 3 days to ask if her son would survive the winter, the man who never spoke his question aloud, afraid the air itself might judge him. What of them? History has no space for their names, no tablets, no records, no songs, but Delphi remembers, because they passed through the smoke. They climbed the sacred way. They looked up at the temple and felt their heartbeats stutter. And they entered not as figures in a history scroll, but as something far more enduring. Presence. They stood there. And that is enough. Sometimes we imagine that legacy means being remembered. That to matter, one must be written down, etched in stone, spoken of in books. But Delphi teaches something softer. Delphi teaches that being forgotten does not mean you were never heard. The dust beneath the temple steps still holds the weight of their footsteps. The walls absorbed their whispers. The air changed slightly when they breathed out their fears for the first time. And the God does not forget, even if the question was never spoken aloud. Even if the offering was only a handful of herbs tied in a ribbon of worn fabric. Even if the pilgrim turned back at the gates, too afraid to approach the oracle herself. Still, the moment existed, and the place received it. Because sacredness does not need volume. It needs intention, and the forgotten carried their intentions like small lights in the dark. You can feel them now, if you walk the ruins slowly, if you pause between the fallen stones, if you close your eyes and let the mountain air brush across your face like a page being turned. They're there, not ghosts, not spirits, just shapes of lives that touched this place and moved on. A woman's soft hum as she waited in line to ask if her husband would return from war. A boy no older than 12, wide-eyed, cradling a broken flute in his hands as an offering. An old man who knew he was too poor to give anything but a poem written on torn parchment, folded tightly in his palm. They are not listed among Delphi's benefactors. They do not appear in the histories, but their breath was here, and breath, once given, never fully disappears. It becomes part of the space. It settles into the grain of the stone. It roots into the very air. So perhaps that is what legacy really is. Not to be remembered, but to be woven into the soil, into the memory of the mountain, into the myth that stretches forward, carrying us even now. Because the forgotten made Delphi holy. Without them, the god would have had no one to speak to. The oracle would have sat in silence. The chasm would have exhaled into empty air. It was the forgotten who asked the real questions. Not about conquest, but about survival, about love, about loss. They brought what mattered, and now they remain in absence. And absence in Delphi is not failure. It is a shape, a space carved by someone who once was here. And that shape is sacred. So, tonight, if you've ever feared being forgotten, if you've wondered whether your story matters in a world that rarely remembers the quiet ones, know this. You're already part of the shape. You're already in the breath, in the dust, in the hush between two falling laurel leaves. You do not need a monument. You need only the moment. And the moment is now. Breathe, and let the god receive you. As he received them, not with thunder, but with recognition. You are here, and that is enough. There were moments, even in Delphi's height, when the god did not speak, and the oracle did not stir. And yet, the pilgrims would weep. Not from grief, not from disappointment, but from something they could not name. Something that passed through the temple like a hush with wings. The priest would say nothing. The oracle would remain behind her veil. But the pilgrims would walk away. Their faces softened, their shoulders lowered, as though something vast and ancient had laid a hand on their hearts. And the only thing that moved that day was the wind. It had come down from Mount Parnassus in a slow, spiraling sigh. It slipped between the pillars. It stirred the ashes of old offerings. It breathed across the laurel leaves like a mother's breath against a child's cheek. And it spoke, not in language, not in riddle, but in reminder. Because the wind has always carried more than air. It carries memory, not ours alone, but the mountains, the earth's, the gods. The wind, after all, was the first messenger. Before scrolls, before speech, before ink ever tried to hold meaning on a page. It carried pollen from tree to tree. It carried the scent of fire, warning the villagers. It carried the dust of one civilization to the edges of another. And in Delphi, it carried something else. Something that felt like a whisper not meant for the ears, but for the soul. They say that once, a priest fell asleep inside the temple, long after the last pilgrim had left. He had no question to ask, only fatigue in his bones, only quiet in his chest. But as he slept, the wind rose, not loud, not sharp, It entered the temple slowly, slipped across his face, and left him weeping in his dreams. When he woke, he said only one thing. I heard her voice, not Apollo's, not a man's, but the earth's, the voice beneath the god, the voice older than fire. It spoke no words, and yet he understood. That is the mystery of the wind. It does not tell us things. It reminds us of what we already know, but have forgotten how to hear. And so, the wind became sacred. Not a symbol, a presence. It was given its own omens, its own rituals. When it moved too quickly, the oracle would delay her trance. When it paused completely, the priest would speak in hushed tones. Because they knew, when the wind is still, so is the world. But when it moves, it speaks. It passes through the bones of statues, through the cracks in the marble, through the mouths of forgotten altars. It carries the breath of those who stood in the temple long before us. Their hopes, their regrets, their quiet prayers folded into air like notes tucked into the hem of a garment. And sometimes, it carries them to us. Have you ever stood outside and felt the wind rise for no reason? Felt it move around you like a thought made physical? That is not chance. That is invitation. Not to know, not to control, but to listen. Because even now, Delphi is not silent. It speaks in leaves that rustle without reason, in doors that creak open when no one is near, in a sudden breeze that moves your hair just before a memory returns. The god may be gone, but the wind has not forgotten. And tonight, as you lie still, your window cracked just enough for air to pass. Let the wind come in. Let it move through your breath. Let it curl beneath your ribs. Let it remind you of things you forgot you knew. You do not need to understand. You only need to receive and know that somewhere, high in a mountain shadow, in a hollow of a temple with no roof, the wind is still speaking, not to give answers, but to keep the question alive. And that is its own kind of prophecy. What remains when the god has left, when the last laurel leaf has withered, when the tripod rusts beneath the moss, and the names of kings are nothing more than dust inside broken amphory? What remains after the prophecy has been spoken, carried on parchment, burned in fire, whispered in palaces, and finally forgotten? What remains is the echo, not the voice, but the space where the voice once lived. And it is still there, in Delphi, in the cracked stones, the windswept path, the sun-bleached column that leans just slightly to the right, in the temple steps worn smooth by centuries of waiting feet. But more than that, it is in you, because every time a story is told, it plants a seed, and you, dear listener, have been walking the sacred way in your own quiet way, listening, imagining, letting the air shift inside you, just a little. And perhaps now, you carry the echo too. It will not shout, it will not interrupt, but in moments of stillness, it may rise, softly, from a space behind your ribs, from the hollowness beneath your sternum, your own aditon, a place carved not for marble, but for memory. You may hear it in the question that keeps returning, the one you haven't dared ask aloud. You may feel it in the hush just before you fall asleep, when a breath stills, when the world softens, and something older than thought begins to speak, not in riddles, not in words, but in sensation, a warmth across your chest, a pressure behind your eyes, a sudden softness in the heart, as though someone has placed their hand there, and simply said, I see you. That is the echo, and echoes, you see, never belong to the past. They are movement. They are what happens when sound touches stone, and the stone remembers. So Delphi is not dead. It is not even asleep. It lives in the way you ask questions, in how you hold mystery, in how you sit with silence, not as punishment, but as prayer. And now, as the final light fades behind the mountains, and the valley curls itself in shadows. Delphi hums with that memory. The god is gone. The oracle is silent. The pilgrim has returned home. And yet, you remain. You, who have listened, who have walked this long path in the mind, who have allowed the veil to lift gently for just a little while. You're a part of the echo now, not because you heard a prophecy, but because you carried it, because you gave space, because you gave breath, and because you were willing to let the story enter without needing to own it. So let this be your offering, this stillness, this night, this final exhale before sleep. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to hold every name. You need only carry the feeling of walking among ruins that are not ruined, of hearing voices that are not sounds, of becoming something that listens, even as you dream. And as you drift now, let the mountain fold you in. Let the wind pass through your chest without resistance. Let the gods sleep, and let the echo, quiet, eternal, remain